Hi there, hi there, hi there, hi there, and welcome back. Welcome back to Thinking Out Loud with Rue. I am Rutendo, and if you're stopping by for the first time, my name is Rutendo, and this is just a channel podcast about bringing in together psychology and my life as a Christian and looking at some of the things that as young adults we're regularly exposed to. And I'm just hoping that this platform gets you to a point of just thinking safely about some of the things that you're experiencing in your life and getting to a point of starting your healing journey. Because when we talk about healing, we think that it's a place that we arrive at. But I'm learning that it's really a journey to get to a point where you're constantly coping with some of the things that affect your mental health and your psychological well-being. So I hope that you like this content and you also decide to subscribe along the journey. But thank you so much to everyone who has been stopping by and to everyone who has been showing their support by commenting and by sharing with the people in their circle. So that at least we can grow together as a community. So today I'm going to be speaking about coping with trauma. And it is a topic that genuinely it hits my soft spot in my heart, because when we speak about trauma, a lot of people have experienced trauma, but they are still struggling to cope with it. I am indeed one of the people who struggled with trauma for a long time, but I didn't have the word for it. I didn't have the emotional vocabulary to be able to say that this was what I was struggling with. And it's very difficult to actually cope with something that you haven't been able to give a definition of, that you haven't been able to acknowledge that you're experiencing, that you haven't been able to identify. So I'm hoping that through this episode, you have the language to be able to identify what is trauma. And the point is not for self-diagnosis, but it's for self-awareness, to be able to see, is this something that I'm struggling with? Is this something that I need more professional help with, to be able to get to that point of starting your journey with healing? Again, I emphasize that because I think it's very important that we're intentional about some of the things that we watch, so that we do get to that point of focusing and investing in our health, in our well-being. So I want to start with just identifying what is trauma. And I'm going to be working with the definition of post-traumatic stress disorder. So I'm just going to be going through some of the diagnostic criteria of post-traumatic stress disorder. So the first, which is A, is you look at the exposure to an actual event. Right? And it doesn't always have to be you being exposed to the event. Sometimes it could be you witnessing an event that was threatening the person's life, or that actually led to the person's life being ended abruptly. And it can also be hearing that someone you love went through something that threatened their well-being or actually caused them to not be here anymore. And finally, it could be continuous exposure to events that threaten people's well-being or that cause death. And this can be for jobs like police officers, it can be for jobs like doctors, it can be psychologists, it can be first responders. So sometimes continual exposure to traumatic events can contribute to a person struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder. And then the second thing that we look at is the person experiencing intrusive symptoms? So basically, intrusive symptoms speaks about things like flashbacks. So what that means is that when you're just going through your day on a regular basis, sometimes you just have moments where images of what happened, what you witnessed, or what you experienced go through your mind, and you just fixate on that and you lose contact with reality, and you just basically fixate your mind on that. And sometimes that's not the only way that you experience intrusive symptoms. You can also experience them in the form of dreams, in the form of just memories coming back to you whilst you're just going by your regular day. And then the next thing is avoidance of stimuli. And what this means is that basically sometimes we do have in our physical world things that remind us of what we went through, right? So whether it is a smell, or it is a place, or it is people, or it is actual things in terms of cars, if a person experienced a car accident, or if a person experienced a mobbing, people then start to avoid certain rooms within their homes where they experienced that trauma, or even avoiding places where a smash and grab happened. So that's all part of just avoiding anything that triggers you to remember that. And it doesn't always have to be external. Sometimes it can be internal. In terms of we start to avoid anything connected to the trauma. If we feel like certain conversations will lead to discussions about the traumatic experience, then we start to avoid conversations connected to that. If we feel like certain people, certain places remind us of that, then we start to also avoid that. And then we also have negative alterations in cognitions and in mood. And basically, this is something that I saw very much with myself. And what that means is that your thought patterns and your mood, or emotions rather, become altered as a result of the traumatic experience that you went through. And basically, it's things like struggling with anger, for example. It's a negative emotion that developed as a result of the trauma that I went through. And I'll go a little bit deeper into that, but you can also see changes in cognition in terms of sometimes there is a self-blame mentality that develops in people who experience trauma, because we're just trying to understand how could what I went through be avoided. And sometimes that's why you find people who have maybe experienced sexual assault, they start to look at what could I have done differently in order to avoid this having happened to me. Or people who lost people in their lives abruptly and they feel like they could have done something to maybe stop that or to avoid that. Then they fixate on those actions that they did or did not do. So sometimes fixating on cognitions that are negative and going to those places of self-blame, of anger, and struggling to come out of that. And then you also have, of course, marked alterations in arousal, and that basically speaks about being hyper-aroused in terms of hypervigilance and, again, anxiety and all these different things that cause you to, your physiology, to be in a place where it's hyperactive, where you are struggling to sleep, you're having sleep challenges because your mind is always hyperactive and you're not able to get to that place of just resting and sleeping. So basically that is the definition of PTSD that I'm working with. And the reason why I'm sharing my story, it's genuinely not for sympathy. Because I don't like those comments of, I'm sorry you went through this, I'm sorry this happened to you. It irks me for some reason. I am just like, okay, the conversation becomes weird for me. But for me, I'm having this conversation because I'm hoping that by having open conversations about some of the things that I've been through, you also allow yourself to be in this space of thinking about what you are experiencing so that you can also get to a point of healing or starting that process. And for me, how PTSD sort of manifested in my life is the actual event was losing my mother to suicide. So I lost my mother to suicide when I was 12 years old, 12 about to turn 13. And learning that someone that I loved and cared for so deeply went through something that was agonizing within their mind and went to the point of ending their lives was difficult for me. And some of the things that I struggled with was, of course, the avoidance of certain places, because going home to my hometown where my mother passed on was difficult for a while. And I tried to avoid that for a little bit. But eventually you get comfortable with visiting a little bit more. And other things that I struggled with was negative alterations in my cognition and emotions. And specifically my emotions, I struggled a lot with anger. And my anger was associated with basically some of the narratives that developed in my mind. And basically that's the thought patterns that I had. And of course, because suicide is something that can be prevented, I thought about what could I have done to prevent that? Could I have been a better daughter? And all these different things ran in my mind. And because technically it can't be changed because it's already done, we can't change the past, it contributed to me just staying in that state of anger and not being able to know how to come out of it. And I hurt people as a result of this anger. I hurt people in my immediate family. I hurt people in the school that I was going to, because I was quite young, dealing with very big emotions. But one of the coping strategies that I personally developed was just not talking about it, not talking about my mother dying. And when people would ask, how did your mother die? I would not go into detail about how she actually died, or I would just come up with a different reason that wasn't the actual reason why she died. Because there would then be conversations about religion, because some people believed different things about heaven, to say that if you ended your life, you're not going to make it to heaven. So for me, there was always a threat about speaking about it. So what my mind did was just to say that it's rather safer to not speak about my mother entirely. And I must say, I went through about 10 years of just speaking about my mother on the surface level, of not going into detail about what I was experiencing, what I was dealing with, because my mind was just like, this is a threat, because you just need to find a way to function and to be able to go about your life in a safe way, in a way that I felt safe when I was younger. And I have to say, for my 12-year-old self, the strategy worked. The strategy worked. It worked because I was able to do my exams. I was able to go to school. I was able to function fairly okay. Not well to the point where we can say that this person is mentally well, but to a point where we can see that this person is functioning and she's able to finish her high school and is able to go to university. It was only up until university when I started to actually question, am I actually doing well? And realizing that some of the coping strategies that I had when I was younger might not work now in the stage that I'm going into in life. And it's not a bad thing, but it's just a self-awareness thing, that some of the strategies that we develop when we are children might not always be functional when we are adults. And it's not to ostracize our younger self or judge them for the decisions that they made, but it's to say that they did the best that they could. We did the best that we could with the information that we had, and with the limited resources that we had at that point in time. But because now I was learning about psychology, and now I had information about trauma, about coping, it meant that I had to look at the ways that I was coping in the past and look at, is it healthy moving into my future with the same coping strategies? And basically that's what I want to spend a lot of time on, just touching, and specifically some of the coping strategies that we develop as children, or that we develop initially when we experience the traumatic experience. Are those coping strategies still strategies that we need to continue with moving forward? So it's a question that we all have to think about. So I think when we're thinking about trauma and the coping strategies that we develop, So for me, like I mentioned before, one of my coping strategies was not talking about it entirely. And I realized that by not talking about it, I am harboring all this anger within me. And it's destroying my relationships. And I wasn't okay with that, because you look in the mirror and you see that relationships are sometimes mirrors into ourselves. We see the anger that other people struggle with, and it bugs us so much, because we also recognize that anger within ourselves. And we're also looking at, if this anger is not okay in another person, why am I making it okay for me? Am I actually going to have relationships that I'm going to be proud of if I continue down the path that I'm currently at, if I continue down that path? And if your answer is no, try to look at the coping strategy that you have right now and ask yourself the question, when did you first see this coping strategy? When did it develop? And if you trace it back and you see that it started when you were trying to cope with something, then ask yourself, what was I trying to cope with? What exactly did my mind think that I needed protection from, or think that I needed to cope with? And once you figure that out, actually admit it to yourself out loud, to say that I am feeling this emotion, or I am feeling I needed this because I went through that. Say it out loud. Actually acknowledge what you experienced, because sometimes we really need to take a flashlight and shine it on some of the parts of ourselves that we struggle to even admit to ourselves. Because when we do that, that's when we are able to start that journey of healing. It starts by being able to actually admit what you went through, that you sometimes have been very much running away from, like myself. And once you do that, it's important to get to the point of literally thanking yourself for concocting these different ways of coping, and seeing, when I first developed it, how did this coping strategy help me? Because even though it's negative now, it's important to acknowledge how it actually initially helped you. What did it protect you from? How did it serve you when you started using this coping strategy? Admit it to yourself, because if we dismiss all coping strategies and say that, no, it's unhealthy, let me leave it entirely because it's unhealthy, and we don't acknowledge why it helped, it's likely to come back. Because sometimes we actually need to understand that coping strategies are named that for a reason. They helped us cope. So if we're able to be curious about our emotions, be curious about our coping strategies and what made them develop in the first place, then we're able to get to that point of coping with them. But it is a journey. Start with being curious without judging yourself for saying that I'm bad because I did 1, 2, 3 to people. Rather start with, why do I keep on doing this to people? Why is it a pattern that I'm seeing all the time? When did that pattern start? Why did that pattern help me? How did it help me? Why did I develop it? And when you get to that point, you start to understand yourself a little bit better. You start to understand why it is that we do certain things that we do. And eventually, then you get to a point of, before we actually get there, it's important to thank yourself for protecting you, for developing these strategies to actually help you, to help you survive. Because I genuinely believe that some of these coping strategies that we develop are to help our survival, to help us from getting to that point of regressing or feeling stuck, or not being able to get out of bed, or not being able to go to school, or not being able to write our exams. So they helped us to a certain extent. So thank the baby you, thank the young adult you for making the decision to be able to save you, for making the tough decisions to be able to get you to a point of coping. And once you've done that, then it's important to get to the point where the older you, the current you, is able to say that, okay, so yes, the younger me helped me, but how can I take over from here? because you can't still let the 12-year-old you make the decision for the 29-year-old you. If the decisions that the 12-year-old you no longer serve the person, the version that you are now. So it's important that the version that you are now is able to take over the reins so that you can get to that point of healing. And again, we're not arriving, but we're starting the journey. And it's important that you also seek for help, for professional support. And I know sometimes places like YouTube, it helps to start the conversation, but sometimes we do need help to look at healthy coping strategies that we can develop moving forward and changing some of the narratives that developed within us that may have been unhealthy. But yeah, so I'm going to end this video here. Tune in again next week and we'll be going through emotional regulation. Thank you so much for stopping by and see you next week. Bye for now. Stay blessed.